Hey guys, welcome to the Men of Iron podcast. As you know, we've been spending the last couple of weeks kind of focusing in on this topic of courageous manhood and really been honing in on restoring masculinity and changing our culture as men with courage. And we introduced this kind of series with this idea that, you know, we at Men of Iron, we've seen this kind of play out in over the last 15 years being an organization and working with men, is there's this consistent theme or a consistent cycle that we can go through as men. And when we decide that we're going to be part of what God is doing, that we really can restore masculinity and we really can change our culture with courage. And we started everything out by kind of going through these cycles of every man has a calling. God gives every man a calling, and for a lot of us, that calling may be unique. It might be unique to some of the other callings that other men in our lives and in our networks may have. But the bottom line is that God has a calling for each of us. We each have our own platform of leadership and influence and responsibilities and roles. And God is going to use those things to glorify Him and to move His kingdom forward, to grow His kingdom. And we see it play out in the life of Moses, that when God gives Moses a calling, he responds with doubt. There's reluctance, right? And that's kind of the second part of this cycle is first, there's a calling. Second part, it goes into man's doubt, man's reluctance. But ultimately, God's grace is so sufficient that it moves us to a point of where it's obedience. So we've got God's calling, man's doubt, that transitions to man's obedience, which then kind of transitions into that last part of the cycle, which is God's supernatural. The supernatural can start to take place in our lives and in the culture that we lead and influence because of our obedience. And we started to kind of get out. We looked last time at Exodus chapter 17, verses 5 and 6. And I'm going to go ahead and read this, and there were a couple things that we talked about, but it says this: "The Lord answered Moses, walk on ahead of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." And then it ends with this: "So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel." And if you remember last week, we introduced a couple things here of how do we restore masculinity? How do we change our culture with courage? Well, God is telling Moses a couple things here. Number one, to get out front. Number two, to embrace mentorship. And number three, to finally act, right? You have to do what God's calling us to do. We have to move forward. We have to make that decision. We have to pull the trigger. We can't just sit there and aim. We have to pull the trigger when God's calling us to go. So that's what God is telling Moses here. Hey, get out front of this. Get out in front of this problem. Get out in front of this opportunity. Get out in front of this solution, whatever it might be. Embrace mentorship. Bring others along with you in that journey. And finally act. And today what I want to focus on is that first piece, which is get out front. And that's exactly what God tells Moses. He says, walk on ahead of the people. And that's really what I want to focus our time on here this morning and today. And that's the piece we're going to talk about, is getting out front. What does that entail? What should I be prepared for? What does it mean to get out front? I think this is going to look a lot differently for each of us, because sometimes God's going to tell us to get out in front of our family. There might be a marriage problem. There might be raising children. There might be family dynamics that are bringing tension to a particular situation. Maybe there's a business decision to make, right? Maybe there's a financial investment and opportunity with your finances. Maybe there's a health thing going on, right? Maybe there's a physical thing going on. Maybe this is just a spiritual need. Like, what is it that God is calling me to do? Well, I love how God tells Moses, get on ahead of the people, get out front. And Moses actually does this. He obeys, he gets out front, he starts to bring the elders with him. He actually acts, he strikes the rock. But it's interesting that when Moses gets out in front of this, if you actually continue reading on in chapter 17 and you get to verse 8, which is just a few verses later, here's Moses doing everything. He gets out in front, does exactly what God calls him to do. And listen to what happens. The Amalekites came, this is verse 8, the Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites. Moses said to Joshua, "Choose some of our men to go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands." So I just find this very interesting that Moses actually gets out front, and what happens is he's attacked. The enemy attacks. I mean, can you imagine being Moses? He's being obedient in this situation. He gets out in front like God tells him to, and he's attacked. And I think there's a very good lesson for us as we start to look at restoring masculinity and changing our culture with courage, is that when God calls a man to do something, I've mentioned this multiple times in this podcast, when God calls a man to do something, rarely is it ever easy. And that's why when we choose to be obedient to what God is calling us to do, and when we choose to get out in front of something and to start to plan and prepare, we need to be battle ready. We need to be battle ready, because it's at that point when we get out in front of the problem, we get out in front of the solution, we get out in front of the opportunity, that the enemy will put on a full press attack. Because now we are taking part in growing the kingdom, multiplying the kingdom, stepping into the lane in which God has designed for us to be in, and the enemy will put on his full press attack. And so when we decide that we're going to get out in front of something, when we decide that we're going to start planning, we're going to start to be intentional, we're going to start to really seek the Lord, get out in front of these things, we need to be battle ready. And I love how this kind of goes on here in verse 9, which is the second part. When we get out front, we need to bring on others. We need to be ready to prepare the next generation. We need to delegate to others to empower. We need to bring others along in this journey. So it's more than just kind of getting out front by ourselves, but we need to look around us and say, okay, who do I need to invite into my journey? Who do I need to invite into this that's going to help? With Moses, he brings Joshua here, right? It says that the Amalekites came and attacked, and Moses said to Joshua, "Choose some of our men and go out and fight the Amalekites." And so Moses, when he gets out front, not only is he battle ready, but he's bringing others along. He's delegating, and he's inviting others into this calling, into this opportunity, because we can't do it ourselves, guys. We need to look around, and we need to bring elders with us. We need to bring people along that can guide us and direct us, but we also need to look for ways to mentor the next generation, to bring others along so that we do exactly what God expects us to do, and that is to help others grow in the process. Man, it is amazing when that happens. And I love if you actually fast forward and go ahead a little bit to chapter 24. Okay, so we're skipping ahead here a little bit, but if you look at verses 13 and 14, it says this: "Then Moses set out with Joshua his aide, and Moses went up on the mountain of God. And he said to the elders, 'Wait here for us until we come back to you. Aaron and Hur are with you, and anyone involved in a dispute can go to them.'" I love this. This is so crucial. Again, his aide, Joshua, that person that he's bringing along, that he's preparing, that he's mentoring, that he's developing, but he's also delegating here to Aaron and Hur and saying, hey, these guys, if you need anything, they are here. They can handle these disputes. And I think this is such a crucial lesson for all of us, that when we get out front, we've got to be battle ready. We've got to prepare that next generation. We've got to delegate to empower so that God's reality, God's promises can come to fruition. It's more than just us in this battle, guys. And that is an intentional process, that when we get out front, there's two different types of people here that we got to invite along. There's those that we need to develop and mentor, and then there's those that can keep us accountable and that can help and aid in our efforts, in God's efforts. And so that's really what I want to encourage all of us with and challenge us with, is as you start to restore masculinity, And as you start to look at ways to change the culture around you with courage, we've got to get out front. And in that, we have to be battle ready, and we've got to look for others to bring along in the process. So, what is God calling you to do? How are you responding to that? Those are some questions that we've been asking you for the last couple of weeks. But now as you decide that you're going to get out in front of this, okay, we have to make sure that we are spiritually strong, physically strong, emotionally strong, socially strong. And then we've got to look for others to bring along. We've got to be battle ready. We've got to look to bring others along in the process. And I can't wait to dive into next time when we talk about embracing mentorship and what does that look like. We'll talk to you guys next week.